Eleanor Mitchell devoted every breath, every moment, and every dream to her 3 daughters. She raised them alone after her husband's death, sacrificing everything to give them the best life possible. But when her body grew tired and her heart longed for company, they were gone. Not a call, not a visit, not even a card on her birthday. This is the heart-wrenching and deeply human story of a forgotten mother, a woman left behind in a windswept seaside cottage, clinging only to fading photographs and the sound of waves crashing in the distance. But just when she thought her story would end in silence, someone came knocking. In a tale filled with painful memories, long-buried secrets, and the chance for unexpected redemption, Eleanor's life takes a turn no one could have imagined. If you've ever loved someone who didn't love you back the way they should have, this story will stay with you. It's about second chances, deep scars, and the courage it takes to open your heart, even when it's already been broken. Stay with us until the end. You won't believe how it finishes. Like, comment, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like Eleanor's, because some stories feel like they were written for your soul. The birthday nobody remembered Eleanor Mitchell sat by the window, the morning sun pouring gently through sheer curtains that fluttered like the wings of birds long gone. Her hands, lined with time, trembled slightly as she lifted a porcelain teacup to her lips. The tea was cold. She hadn't noticed, or maybe she hadn't cared. It was her 74th birthday, and no one had called. No flowers, no cards, no half-laughing voicemails saying, "Sorry, Mom, I got busy, how could I forget?" Not even a silly meme from Rachel, her eldest, who used to flood her phone with cat videos and sunflower emojis. Silence. She sat there in her little home in upstate Vermont, where the trees had already begun to burn with color. The wind smelled like cinnamon and wet leaves. Fall was always her favorite, cozy, reflective, rich in memory. But today, the season seemed to mock her. Every rustling leaf outside was a whisper of what she used to have. 3 daughters. 3 beautiful, stubborn, dazzling girls who once clung to her skirt, screamed her name when they scraped their knees, fought over who got the bigger slice of cake. Now, nothing. Rachel, the lawyer in Boston, too busy. Caroline, the yoga instructor in Santa Fe, too spiritual for phone calls. And Natalie. Well, Natalie had always been the wild one, the musician, the dreamer, the drifter. Eleanor hadn't heard from her in over 8 months. Last she knew, Natalie was in Berlin, or maybe Barcelona. Eleanor got up slowly and wandered toward the mantel. There were pictures everywhere, frozen smiles, a family once tightly knit like the quilts she used to sew. There was that photo from the Cape, Rachel holding a fish almost as big as she was. Another one, baby Caroline asleep on Eleanor's chest, her tiny fist tangled in her mother's hair. And Natalie, young, fierce, barefoot, playing the violin in the middle of the backyard while everyone clapped. She traced her finger over the glass. "Where did you all go?" she whispered. The kettle clicked off behind her, unnoticed. She wasn't even sure why she turned it on. Maybe out of habit, maybe to fill the silence. But silence has a weight, and today it pressed against her like grief. That afternoon, Eleanor baked herself a cake. Not the fancy kind, just yellow cake from a box with chocolate frosting. She didn't even have candles, so she stuck a tea light in the center and lit it anyway. "Make a wish," she muttered aloud. She closed her eyes. But the wish didn't come. Not like when she was younger and wished for Doug to come home safe from the paper mill, or when the girls were teenagers, and she'd wish for just one day without someone slamming a door, or those bitter years after the divorce when she'd pray, fiercely, silently, not to feel so invisible. Now, She didn't know what to wish for. She wasn't sure she believed in wishes anymore. She sat on the porch, the sun dipping low, the air thick with the scent of pine needles and something else. Loneliness, maybe. A kind of scent that only comes from too many birthdays forgotten. But then something stirred. Not a phone call, not a knock on the door. A memory. One so sharp and alive it made her blink. It was years ago, a birthday when she'd turned 38. The girls had made her breakfast in bed, burnt toast, orange juice with way too much pulp, and a single daffodil picked from the neighbor's yard. Natalie, just 4, had drawn a picture of Mommy with angel wings. Eleanor remembered laughing until she cried. She remembered feeling seen, and that memory, brief, vivid, almost cruel in its beauty, sparked something in her. Not quite anger, not quite resolve, something quieter, sadder, stronger. "I'm still here," she said aloud, and maybe that was the moment things began to shift, not because her daughters would suddenly remember, but because she would. She would remember herself, her strength, her stories, her fire, even if no one else did. The next morning, Eleanor woke up before the sun. It wasn't out of excitement. It wasn't even habit anymore. Her body simply no longer needed the rest it once did. Or perhaps it had grown tired of dreaming. Dreams had a way of turning cruel, offering versions of life that vanished at dawn like fog on glass. She shuffled into the kitchen, poured herself a cup of lukewarm coffee from the old percolator. It sputtered, protested, but still worked, just like her. She sat at the tiny round table by the window, where once her girls had fought over cereal boxes and told her the dreams they had, or the monsters under their beds. Now, the only monster was silence. She opened her notebook. The leather cover was worn at the edges, its pages filled with thoughts she hadn't dared say out loud. Letters to herself, observations, grocery lists, and little stories. The world didn't ask for her voice anymore, but she gave it to herself in pen and ink, like breadcrumbs leading back to who she used to be. She flipped to a clean page and wrote, "Yesterday was my birthday." No one remembered, but I did. She paused. Maybe that's enough. She closed the book and stared out the window again. The wind had picked up. Leaves chased each other across the yard like children playing tag. Eleanor stood slowly. Her knees groaned, but she didn't complain. Complaining never brought anything back. Instead, she went to the garage and stood before an old box covered in dust. Inside were her tools, her paintbrushes, her stained apron, and a half-finished canvas of Lake Champlain at sunset. Doug used to joke that she painted better skies than God himself, and the girls, well, they used to sit beside her on the grass, each with a tiny brush and a jelly jar of water, mimicking her strokes, getting more paint on their faces than the paper. She hadn't painted in years, not since the house got quieter, not since she stopped feeling like someone worth painting for. But today, she felt something new stir. Not happiness, not yet, but a kind of tug, like the earth beneath her feet was gently reminding her, "You are not done yet." She carried the canvas back into the light. That afternoon, Eleanor walked to town, just 3 blocks down to the market and back, but for her, it felt like miles. Her legs ached by the second block. Still, she kept going. At the corner bakery, the young girl behind the counter, Annie maybe, smiled at her. "Hello, Mrs. Mitchell. How are you today?" Eleanor blinked. "You remembered my name?" Annie laughed. "Of course I did. You used to bring us cookies at Christmas." That small kindness lit something warm in her chest. Maybe not everyone had forgotten. Maybe the world still held tiny pockets of memory, folded between moments like a letter in an old coat pocket. She bought a small lemon tart. Not because she was hungry, but because she used to love lemon before everything dulled. That evening, she painted. She sat in front of the canvas, dipped her brush into the faded colors, and began again. The sunset she once abandoned came alive under her fingers, layer by layer. Orange over pink, blue melting into gold. Her hands moved slowly but surely, like they were remembering a dance from long ago. As the sky took shape, she wept. Not out of sorrow, but relief. She still had color inside her, still had something to give. At exactly 9:43 p.m., her landline rang. She stared at it for a moment, startled, almost afraid. Then she picked it up. Hello? A pause. Hi, Mom. It was Rachel. Her voice, rushed, distracted. Eleanor could hear traffic, a car horn, the hum of a life too full. I meant to call earlier, but the firm's been crazy. They moved my trial date again and, well, you know how it is. Eleanor swallowed. Yes, I suppose I do. Anyway, happy birthday. I'm sorry it's late. I love you, okay? I'll call again soon. Maybe even visit next month. And before Eleanor could reply, the call ended. The silence returned, but this time it didn't sting as much. Because Eleanor had already begun to rebuild something the girls hadn't given her in years. A life of her own. The vanishing thread, Eleanor Mitchell, stood at the edge of her garden where rosemary and lavender stretched lazily under the morning sun, their scents whispering memories from a time when laughter echoed in these hedges. Once, little hands had tugged at her skirt, begging for a story. Once, 3 daughters had chased each other between rose bushes, giggling like life would never pull them apart. But time, that old thief, had taken more than youth. It had taken their closeness, their shared language of love. Rachel hadn't called since Christmas. Caroline had sent a terse text about a delayed meeting, and Natalie had vanished into a whirlwind of ambition and social climbing, only surfacing when she needed something: money, advice, a babysitter, a connection. The house Eleanor once filled with love and sacrifice had grown quiet, but not empty. No, not yet. That morning, a letter arrived. Real paper, blue ink, unusual. Eleanor's heart leapt, but it wasn't from her daughters. It was from Sylvia Blake, a friend she hadn't spoken to in 15 years, back when both their husbands were still alive. Sylvia had moved to the coast after her own children went astray, and her words now cut deep. I thought of you when I watched a mother on the beach picking up seashells alone. Not every woman who gives everything to her children ends up cherished in the end. Some of us become invisible. Invisible. The word stung more than she expected. She had become that, the mother who waits in silence, who smiles too wide at distant voices over the phone, who isn't invited to birthday parties anymore unless it's for decoration or duty. And worse, she had let them relegate her to the margins of their lives out of guilt, busyness, or discomfort with how much they owed. But Eleanor wasn't bitter. No, bitterness was for those who still hoped. She had passed hope and now stood at resignation. Until the knock came. It was late, nearly 10 p.m. She had already folded the laundry and sat by the fireplace with an old photo album when the firm knock echoed through the hallway. Pulling her cardigan tighter, she shuffled to the door. When she opened it, she expected a neighbor, or maybe a mistake. Instead, it was a young woman, barely 20, with tearful eyes and trembling fingers holding an envelope. She didn't introduce herself, just whispered, "Are you Eleanor Mitchell?" "Yes," Eleanor said, cautious. "This is from him," the girl said. He didn't know where else to turn. Before Eleanor could ask who, the girl fled down the steps, disappearing into the misty road. She looked at the envelope. There was no return address, just a single word written in pen across the back. Matthew. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. The name brought 1,000 emotions surging like a tide, crashing against everything she'd rebuilt to protect her heart. Matthew Langford. Not a lover, not family, but the boy she had once saved and had to give away. Back in her late 30s, Eleanor had quietly taken in Matthew when he was only 6, bruised, hungry, forgotten, a child abandoned by a distant cousin with nowhere else to go. Eleanor had protected him, fed him, held him through night terrors, but he wasn't hers, not legally. And when his birth mother returned, high on a promise of rehab and redemption, Eleanor had no right to stop the courts. She never heard from him again, until now. She opened the letter with shaking hands. Dear Eleanor, I don't know if you'll even remember me, but I remember you. I remember the soup you made with dumplings, the way you tucked in my feet when I was sick, the stories about stars being ancestors watching over us. I remember that you made me feel loved when no one else did. I've spent years trying to outrun my past, my addictions, my pain. I've made a mess of things, but I never forgot you. I'm in trouble now, and I don't know who else to turn to. If you can, if you're still the kind of woman who saves boys like me, I'll be at the bus station in Madison, 7 a.m. Wednesday. You don't have to come. I'll understand. But if you do, I'll be waiting. M. Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest and wept, not because of pain, but because for the first time in years, someone needed her without condition, without expectation of convenience. Someone remembered her love. She had 2 nights to decide. Rachel wouldn't understand. Caroline would lecture. Natalie wouldn't even answer. But Eleanor knew she would go. Not because she owed him, not even because she missed being a mother. She would go because she was still Eleanor, still the woman who showed up for the forgotten. The journey backward to move forward. Eleanor stood in the dim kitchen before dawn, the letter from Matthew clutched in her hand like a lifeline. Outside, the morning mist hung heavy over the garden, softening the edges of the roses and rosemary she had tended so carefully over the years. Her breath clouded the glass of the window as she stared out, her thoughts a blur of fear, hope, and aching memories. She packed a small overnight bag. Not too much, just enough to signal she wasn't moving permanently, but that this journey mattered. A warm coat, a scarf Rachel had given her long ago, back when gifts still came with hugs, and a small thermos for tea. On impulse, she tucked in the faded photograph of a 6-year-old Matthew grinning with 2 missing front teeth, taken the summer he'd lived with her, a reminder of who she'd once been, who she might still be. As she locked up the house, her phone buzzed, a message from Carolyn. Don't forget Rachel's event on Saturday. Try not to be late this time. No, how are you, Mom? No, I love you. Just expectation. Just another reminder of her role, the silent witness to their curated lives. Eleanor typed a reply, then deleted it. She didn't owe an explanation. Not anymore. The drive to Madison took nearly 5 hours. Highway signs flicked past like pages of a book she didn't want to read. Her hands gripped the wheel, knuckles pale, but her mind wandered, back to the sound of Matthew's laugh, his nightmares, how he clung to her during thunderstorms and whispered, "Don't let them take me." She arrived at the station at 6:48 a.m. The place was quiet, gray and hollow, with the cold breath of winter. Travelers shuffled past with coffee cups and headphones, eyes dulled by routine. Eleanor's heart beat fast, as if she were 17 again, waiting for something, or someone, that might never come. And then she saw him. He stood near the vending machine, older, thinner, face lined with time and choices. His coat was worn, backpack frayed, but his eyes, those deep brown eyes, still carried that same flicker of vulnerability, of hope. He saw her, straightened, then looked down, uncertain. Eleanor stepped forward. "Matthew." He turned toward her, and his voice cracked. "I didn't think you'd come." She reached for his hand. "Of course I came." They sat on a bench under the flickering station lights. At first, the conversation was shallow, weather, traffic, old memories floating like leaves on a stream. But soon the dam broke. "I was in a bad place," he said, eyes glassy. "I've been through rehab twice. I tried to fix things, but I just kept falling apart. I got clean 6 months ago, started writing, thought I might reach out, but I didn't think I deserved to." "You always deserved love," Eleanor whispered. He looked at her, shame and longing battling behind his eyes. "You were the only one who made me feel human." Eleanor blinked back tears. She didn't need to be thanked, just remembered. They spent the day walking the city, sharing a meal at a small diner. She listened as Matthew talked about his years drifting through shelters and halfway homes, the people he lost, the nights he thought he wouldn't make it. And in those hours, Eleanor felt something inside her begin to thaw. She wasn't just a mother to daughters who had forgotten her worth. She was the memory that saved a boy. She was the echo of warmth in a world that had grown so cold. That evening, as they prepared to part, Matthew handed her a worn notebook. "I wrote this. It's my story, but it's yours, too, because without you, there wouldn't be one." Eleanor held it to her chest. He hugged her, tight and real. "Thank you for coming." She drove home under the stars, the radio playing softly. For the first time in years, she didn't feel forgotten. She felt found, and something told her, this was just the beginning. A letter never sent back in her quiet home, Eleanor placed the worn notebook on the kitchen table like it was something sacred. Her hands hovered over the cover, unsure whether to open it or leave it closed, like a sealed memory. But eventually she sat down, poured herself a cup of tea, and slowly turned the first page. His handwriting, rough and rushed in places, careful and deliberate in others, was unmistakably Matthew's. His words were raw, unpolished, real. They spoke of sleepless nights in cold shelters, of small kindnesses from strangers, of the guilt he carried for years for being the boy nobody wanted. But every few chapters, Eleanor's name appeared. She wasn't always mentioned directly. Sometimes she was the woman with soft hands, the only one who asked if I'd eaten, the porch light that was always on. By the 5th page, her tears blurred the ink. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the notebook pressed to her chest, her heart pulled in opposite directions. On one side, the quiet gratitude that someone had remembered her love. On the other, the gaping absence her daughters had carved into her soul. In the morning, she sat at her writing desk, the same one Douglas had given her on their 15th anniversary, and pulled out a single sheet of stationery. She began writing. "Dear Rachel, I visited someone you don't remember, a boy who once lived with us for 6 months when your father's cousin passed away. His name was Matthew. He wasn't born to me, but for a short while, he was mine in every way that mattered." The letter poured out of her like a confession. She wrote about the loneliness, about being sidelined at birthdays and holidays, about the times she smiled through tears and clapped for the achievements of daughters who no longer saw her as anything more than background scenery. She told Rachel how it felt to be forgotten, not by time, but by the people you once gave your whole life to, and she ended with a sentence she never thought she'd write. "I am more than your mother. I am a woman who has a story, and I think it's time I stopped apologizing for wanting to be part of it again." She sealed the envelope, but she didn't address it. Not yet. Instead, Eleanor went out to the garden. The wind was sharp, the earth still damp from last night's rain. She knelt by the rose bushes she'd planted when the girls were toddlers, one for each of them. They had names then: Rachel's Whisper, Caroline's Fire, and Natalie's Song. Most had withered, but a few remained, stubborn and soft in the chill. As she trimmed a thorny stem, her neighbor, Mrs. Delacroix, peeked over the fence. "Good morning, Eleanor," she called. "You're up early?" "I had a lot on my mind," Eleanor replied. Mrs. Delacroix tilted her head. "You know, I always meant to ask, do you ever sell those roses?" Eleanor paused. "I never thought to." "Well, you should," the older woman said. "You have a gift, and it's time you started using it for yourself." Later that day, Eleanor pulled out a folder of old drawings, sketches she'd made of flower arrangements, garden layouts, bouquet ideas she once dreamed of selling after retirement. Back when retirement still sounded like something joyful. She dusted off the folder and opened a blank page. "Eleanor's Garden," she wrote at the top, then below it, "Blooms for the forgotten, the brave, and the beginning again." It felt silly, but it also felt real. Maybe she couldn't change her daughters. Maybe she couldn't force them to see her, but she could change the story she lived in. She could write her own chapters, and maybe, just maybe, someone would read them. Tea with Strangers. The next Saturday, Eleanor walked into the town's weekly artisan fair with a woven basket of hand-picked blooms, soft pinks, muted creams, and a few stubborn yellow roses that refused to stop blooming despite the season's change. She wore a blue scarf Caroline had given her 15 years ago and a pin Matthew had made from beach stones when he was 10. It wasn't much, but it made her feel anchored, like she wasn't arriving empty-handed, even if her confidence wavered. She rented half a table at the very end of the row, beside a teenage girl selling knitted animals and a soft-spoken man named Paul who made birdhouses out of salvaged wood. Her sign, painted in faded ink, read, "Eleanor's Garden, Flowers for Healing, Hope and Second Chances." For a long while, no one stopped. The crowd buzzed around the stands with honey jars, handmade soap, and local bread. People smiled politely but kept walking. Eleanor adjusted her sign, rearranged the roses, considered packing up, and then a young woman stopped. She had short auburn hair, ink smudges on her fingers, and sadness stitched into the corners of her smile. "Hi," she said softly. "Your sign. It says Second Chances. Are these sympathy flowers?" Eleanor hesitated. "They can be, but mostly they're for people who feel forgotten, or who want to forgive someone, or who just need a little beauty without explanation." The girl blinked quickly, then looked away. "I haven't spoken to my mom in 4 years. I don't even know why anymore." Eleanor handed her a small bouquet of white lilacs and lavender sprigs tied with blue ribbon. "Take these. You can send them to her, or just keep them. No pressure. Just healing." The girl took the bouquet like it might fall apart in her hands. She didn't cry, but her breath hitched as she whispered, "Thank you," and walked off. That day, Eleanor gave away more flowers than she sold. Each interaction wasn't about profit. It was a shared moment, a connection, and with each one, she felt a little more visible, a little more herself. By the end of the market, Paul, the birdhouse maker, approached her with a grin. "I saw what you did today. That's not just a flower table. That's therapy with petals." Eleanor laughed, and the sound surprised even her. "Maybe I've got more in me than I thought." Paul reached into his pocket and handed her a card. "If you ever want to collaborate, Maybe a flower and birdhouse combo gift for new homeowners. I'd be happy to. She took the card. That's kind of you. As the sky turned golden and the stalls packed up, Eleanor felt something she hadn't in years. Purpose. Not the kind born of duty to others, but the kind that whispered, "This is yours." Not borrowed from marriage, not tied to children, not defined by giving away pieces of herself. On her way home, she passed by the post office. The letter she wrote to Rachel was still in her purse, sealed, heavy. She stood at the mailbox for a long moment, finger hovering, but in the end, she placed it back in her bag. Not today, not yet. Her story was still unfolding, and maybe, just maybe, the next chapter didn't need to be written for anyone else. Just for her. The letter I didn't expect. The morning fog settled over the hills like a cotton shawl. Eleanor stood in her kitchen with her hands wrapped around a chipped blue mug, one that had once belonged to her husband. The silence in the cottage was no longer haunting. It was companionable now. She had started to greet the day like an old friend, slowly and with a soft nod of acknowledgement. It had been 3 weeks since the market, 3 weeks since Eleanor began handing out small bouquets and stories at the artisan fair. Every Saturday, she returned to her spot beside Paul and the teenage knitter, whom she now knew as Lila. They shared laughs, lunches, and sometimes long pauses filled with understanding. Strangers became familiar faces. Then familiar faces became names. She wasn't invisible here. And then the letter arrived. It was late morning. The mail truck came rumbling up the dirt road and stopped at her box, as it did every weekday. Eleanor, barefoot in her garden boots, walked down the path lined with early asters and cosmos to retrieve the post, expecting bills, a seed catalog, or one of those local magazines with too many coupons. Instead, she found it. A cream-colored envelope with her name written in a hesitant hand. There was no return address, but Eleanor knew the handwriting instantly. It was Caroline's. Her breath caught. The envelope trembled in her hand as if it carried too much weight for its size. She walked back to the house in slow, careful steps, each one echoing memories she had tried not to relive. Caroline as a child, with her wild laughter, her sharp wit, her need to control everything after their father died. The last bitter phone call before silence settled between them like frost. She didn't open the letter right away. Instead, she set it on the kitchen table and made herself tea. She watered the spider plant by the window, fed the robins that came scratching near the stone wall, folded a tea towel that didn't need folding. Then she sat down, finally, and opened the envelope. Dear Mom, I don't know how to start this. Maybe I should say I'm sorry, but that feels too easy, and maybe too late. Natalie found one of your bouquets in a park. She didn't know it was yours at first, but there was a note attached. You always did love notes. When I saw your name, I cried. Not the loud, sobbing kind, the kind that makes your whole chest ache in silence. I thought I had buried you with my pride. I thought it was better to stay angry than to face what I had become. But here you are, still sending beauty into the world, still showing up, still you. I don't deserve anything from you, but I want to ask, if you can, would you write me back? I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a thread, just one, so I can find my way back. Love, Caroline. Eleanor didn't move. The house was still. Even the kettle had gone quiet. She placed the letter down like it was made of glass. Her heart pounded, not from pain but from something else. A thread. It was such a small request, but also so vast. She got up and opened the drawer where she kept her best stationery. It was cream-colored too, but thick, with pressed violets in the corners. She took a pen, breathed in slowly, and began to write. Dear Caroline, thank you for your letter, the one I didn't expect, but maybe have always hoped for. You don't need to be perfect to come home. You only need to be real. I can meet you there. The thread you asked for is already tied. It never broke, not in me. It only got tangled. Let's begin there. She signed her name with a hand steadier than she thought she had. Then she placed the letter into a new envelope and walked it down the same path, past the cosmos and asters, and dropped it into the mailbox with a quiet whisper, Come home when you're ready. When Rachel called Eleanor, had just finished her afternoon walk along the cliffs that hugged the edge of the village. The sea was restless that day, waves tumbling like children with no concern for grace. She liked walking there, not for the view alone, but for the reminder that even the most chaotic waters found a rhythm again. That thought often calmed her. She'd just kicked off her boots when the landline rang. The sound startled her. Few people ever called that number now. Most had turned to email or silence. She wiped her hands on her cardigan and picked up the receiver. Hello? A pause. Then a cautious voice. Mom? Eleanor froze. Her lips parted, but her throat felt too tight to speak. It's Rachel, her oldest, the one who had been the most bitter, the one who had said the cruelest things before leaving, as if hurting Eleanor deeply would somehow protect her from her own shame. Eleanor remembered every word, not because she wanted to, but because those were the words that had ended their connection. Eleanor found her voice. Rachel, I didn't know if I should call. I saw Caroline's post. She said you'd written her back. She sent me a letter, Eleanor said softly. There was silence. Then Rachel's voice cracked. I didn't write you. I didn't leave a bouquet. I didn't do anything but leave. And now I feel like I'm the only one who doesn't deserve a place in your heart anymore. Don't say that, Eleanor whispered. You were never out of my heart, only out of my sight. Rachel exhaled shakily. It's strange. I always thought you were too soft, too forgiving, always letting things go. I thought that was weakness. But now I see how strong that kind of love really is. Eleanor sat down slowly. Rachel, I never wanted you to be perfect. I wanted you to be whole, even if that meant being far away from me. I'm not whole, Rachel admitted. I've built a life that looks beautiful on the outside, husband, house, career, but I'm so lonely, and I think it's because I pushed away the one person who showed me how to love without condition. Eleanor felt tears slide silently down her cheek. Then come visit. No expectations, no guilt, just time. I'd like that, Rachel said. I'd like to bring the kids, if you'd have us. Eleanor laughed, a sound that felt like spring water breaking through dry earth. Oh, Rachel, I've been growing wildflowers just for them. For the next hour, mother and daughter spoke like old friends, catching up after years apart. They spoke about little things, Rachel's daughter's obsession with caterpillars, Eleanor's favorite marmalade recipe, the new blooms in the garden. And in that hour, without saying it directly, they mended 1,000 threads once frayed by pride. After the call, Eleanor stepped outside. The sun had broken through the clouds, and her garden bathed in soft golden light. A breeze carried the scent of lavender and rosemary. She tilted her head to the sky and whispered, "Thank you," to no one and everyone at once. And in the distance, a robin sang, a bright, unbroken tune that sounded exactly like forgiveness. Caroline's arrival. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Rachel's phone call, and Eleanor had resumed a rhythm of life both familiar and strangely exciting. The garden had never looked more vibrant, her fingers tenderly coaxing life from the soil like a mother smoothing the forehead of a sleeping child. But on the morning of the 8th day of May, She awoke with a twinge of nervous anticipation fluttering in her chest. Caroline was coming. Unlike the tearful call with Rachel, Caroline's message had come via postcard, a watercolor print of a countryside chapel, the kind Eleanor might have painted in her youth. Scribbled in Caroline's brisk, looping hand was a single line, "I want to come see you, if you're willing." She hadn't written more. She hadn't needed to. Eleanor had responded immediately, leaving the porch light on every night since. Her heart ached for closure, but hoped even more for connection. As the village bus rolled to a gentle stop near her gate, Eleanor stood in her pressed lavender blouse and warm gray skirt, hands wringing the edge of her cardigan. The door opened, and there she was, Caroline, her middle child, the dreamer, the one with art in her soul and rebellion in her spine. Her eyes were weary, framed with faint lines that hadn't been there before. But when she smiled, it was the same smile that once melted snowmen Eleanor couldn't bear to take down from the windows in winter. They stood still for a moment, no words, just gazes flickering between sorrow, recognition, apology, and an unspoken question. Are we still the same? Eleanor opened her arms. Caroline dropped her bag and fell into them. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I should have come sooner." "No," Eleanor replied, holding her close. "You came when you were ready." They spent that evening in the garden, sipping tea with wild mint Eleanor had picked minutes before. Caroline wandered from flower bed to flower bed, recalling childhood memories like they were buried treasures. "Do you still paint?" Eleanor asked, watching her daughter trail her fingers over a rust-colored dahlia. "Not often," Caroline admitted. "Life got noisy and messy. I forgot how quiet things used to be." Eleanor touched her hand. "Then maybe this is where you remember." That night, Caroline chose the room with the lilac curtains, the one that used to be hers. She unpacked a sketchbook and pencils she hadn't used in years. Eleanor saw her sitting cross-legged at the window by candlelight, tracing the shape of the moon with gentle, precise lines. In the days that followed, they walked along the beach, picked up broken shells and driftwood, shared recipes and tears, and even opened the old photo albums, long neglected in the cabinet behind the sofa. It was during one of these moments, flipping through a photo of the girls in yellow dresses standing beside their father's old car, that Caroline said, "I used to think love had to be earned, that if I wasn't enough, you'd stop loving me. So I kept testing the line to see how far I could push it." Eleanor's hand closed over hers. "I never had a line, Caroline. You could never fall far enough to be out of my love." Caroline looked down, lips trembling. "I wish I'd believed you." "You believe me now?" Caroline nodded, eyes brimming. "Yes, I do." Eleanor leaned back, letting silence wrap around them like a warm shawl. Forgiveness had arrived quietly, like snow melting underfoot, changing everything, one droplet at a time. That night, Eleanor wrote in her journal, "Today, the child with the wild heart came home. She carries guilt like a shadow, but her laughter now spills like spring rain. I think we are both healing, and the house, once echoing with silence, now hums with the sound of grace." The girl with the red scarf. It was a Tuesday when Eleanor first heard the knock. It wasn't hurried like Rachel's had been, or hesitant like Caroline's. It was steady, 4 clear taps, bold in its confidence, but unfamiliar in rhythm. Eleanor, who had been kneading dough in the kitchen, wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to find a young woman standing beneath the flowering archway, her auburn curls spilling beneath a faded red scarf tied around her head. "Are you Eleanor Mitchell?" the girl asked, her voice polite, almost rehearsed. Eleanor nodded. "Yes. Can I help you?" The girl blinked, then exhaled a breath she seemed to have held for a long time. "I'm Natalie," she said. "Your granddaughter." The world stopped. Eleanor's hands dropped to her sides. The sound of the sea faded. Even the sparrows nesting on the eaves seemed to pause. "My granddaughter," she whispered. Natalie gave a shaky smile. "I'm Ivy's daughter." Ivy, the daughter who had never called, never written, who had taken and taken until there was nothing left but a silence so sharp it could slice memory. "I don't expect you to invite me in," Natalie said quickly, seeing the storm cross Eleanor's eyes. "But I needed to see you, to know if the stories were true, about how kind you were, about the garden, about the woman who once carried 3 little girls through a war of her own." Eleanor stood motionless, her heart a strange mix of longing and pain. Ivy had never allowed pictures, never sent holiday cards, and yet here stood this girl, with Eleanor's cheekbones and the same stubborn curve to her chin. Natalie hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small, wrinkled envelope. "Ivy wrote this for you a year before she passed." Eleanor's breath caught. "She passed?" Natalie nodded. "Last summer. Breast cancer. It was quick." Eleanor took the letter with trembling hands and stepped aside. "Come in," she said softly. The hearth was still warm. Caroline, startled by the unfamiliar voice, peeked from the hallway and froze when she saw the girl. Natalie's eyes widened. "You're Aunt Caroline," Caroline blinked, "and you're Ivy's daughter." The 3 women sat in silence for a time. Eleanor read the letter in the corner of the room, her eyes scanning Ivy's shaky handwriting, apologies inked in sorrow, confessions dressed as stories, and a final line that broke her completely. "I know I was the cruelest to you, but I want you to know I never stopped loving you. I just didn't know how to say it without sounding like a stranger." Eleanor folded the paper carefully and placed it on the table. "She's gone," she whispered. "She's really gone." And for the first time in decades, she wept, not out of bitterness, but release. Caroline held her, and Natalie sat quietly, her hands folded over her lap, unsure if she belonged in this moment, but aching to be allowed. When the storm passed, Eleanor turned to Natalie. "Do you like lemon tarts?" she asked. Natalie blinked, surprised. "Yes, my mom used to make them when she missed someone." Eleanor stood. "Then we'll bake them together." And just like that, the healing continued, one unexpected guest, one fragile letter, one lemon tart at a time. That evening, Eleanor opened her journal once more. She wears a red scarf like Ivy once did. Her eyes are her own, but the fire in her voice, it's familiar. I did not expect a granddaughter today. I did not expect Ivy's forgiveness, sealed in a trembling hand. But here we are, a new generation, a new beginning. A house full of light spring arrived like a soft sigh through the coastal hills, and with it, a sense of completion Eleanor Mitchell hadn't felt in decades. It had been 6 months since Natalie arrived, her presence a quiet but powerful shift in the rhythm of Eleanor's days. Where once there had been silence, now there was laughter in the kitchen. Where there had been stillness, now there were 2 pairs of hands in the garden tending tulips and thyme. Rachel had returned twice more, not out of guilt this time, but with an earnest desire to mend. Her visits were still brief, her words still too formal, but Eleanor had stopped expecting perfect apologies. She now knew the difference between performance and sincerity, and Rachel, in her awkward attempts to help with the dishes or join in walks to the bakery, was trying in her own imperfect way. Caroline had moved back in. "I thought I came to help you," she'd said one morning, sipping tea in her childhood bedroom, "but it turns out you've helped me remember who I used to be." And so, The house that had once echoed with the loneliness of abandonment began to glow with something else entirely. The living room became a workshop of projects, Natalie sketching new patterns for her design school portfolio, Caroline editing her essays, Eleanor sewing new cushion covers from fabric long forgotten in the attic. They cooked together. They fought too sometimes, about whether too much salt had been added to the soup or if the old record player still worked. But even those moments had a tenderness to them, a kind of sacred bickering that only exists when people feel safe enough to argue. One Sunday morning, Eleanor found Natalie sitting in the garden with a photo album open on her lap. "These are yours?" Natalie asked, pointing to a faded picture of Eleanor holding a baby. "Yes," Eleanor said. "That's Rachel, the day I brought her home. She wouldn't stop crying unless I held her that way." Natalie smiled. "She looks like a storm." Eleanor chuckled. "She was." Then Natalie looked up, eyes brimming with a question she'd clearly been holding on to for weeks. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Staying, forgiving, letting people back in after they hurt you?" Eleanor paused, then sat beside her. "I used to," she admitted. "I used to think I was a fool. But then I realized something. Love, real love, is not a transaction. It doesn't balance books or keep score. It bends. Sometimes it even breaks. But it also rebuilds. And when it rebuilds honestly, it's stronger." She took Natalie's hand and squeezed it gently. "You don't always get the apology you deserve, but sometimes you get the chance to write a better story anyway." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Eleanor walked out into the garden. The moon was high, and the sea hummed in the distance like a lullaby. She stood beneath the magnolia tree and whispered into the wind, "I forgive you, Ivy. I hope you found peace." And then, with tears in her eyes and a heart no longer held hostage by the past, she turned back toward the house. A house no longer haunted by echoes, but filled with light, voices, and the quiet promise of redemption. Before bed, Eleanor wrote the final lines in her journal. "The story didn't end the way I thought it would. It ended better, not because everything was fixed, but because we chose to begin again. I am no longer waiting to be loved by the past. I am loved in the present, and that, at last, is enough."